I get the icon in cornflower blue?
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 38 of Can I Get That Software in Blue? I'm one of your hosts, Chad Tyndall. Back here with me after recusing himself from episode 37 due to a perceived conflict of competition, my co-host, my brother from another mother, the artisan of AI, the emperor of Elastic, reigning supreme on Stack. Welcome back, Steve Mazak.
Chad, it's great to be back. Thank you.
It's been a few months since we did an episode. I think
Yep.
last one was in May. We took a little hiatus here.
Yeah, people have been asking. Like all three people I know that listen have been asking.
There's more than three people who listen.
I know, I'm just kidding.
There's dozens of them. No, hundreds.
Dozens.
Thousands.
I love it.
It's blowing up. It's blowing up. I think we just crossed 20,000 listens or something
Did
like
we
that.
seriously?
So, yeah, it's blowing up.
Yeah, I love it.
You know, slowly but surely.
Well, what happened between then and now is Chad made it weird because he joined a competitor.
Oh, man. Chad made it weird. I know. It's like a meme. You got to have a meme here. Chad made it weird.
At some point, we might have to have a vector database bake-off or something on the pod.
Oh, gosh. I think we should stay away from that and just stick to like happy topics.
That's also fun.
Yeah, that's also fun. All right. Well, we have a guest here today joining the show or text the scene. He's an expert in cybersecurity and the AI machine, a leader in the field who innovates. It's Cloudflare's field CTO, John Engates. Welcome to the show.
Hey, guys. How are you?
Good. Thanks, John.
Good to see you. Look, it's Christmas season.
Yeah, we got ugly sweaters, ugly jackets going, everybody but Steve. I don't know.
Well, you could say this is an ugly shirt. I'll back up so everyone can see it, and we'll see how many people get the joke.
It's an ugly shirt. All right. Yes, it's a Dare shirt with a crack addict on it.
Yes, from the Dave Chappelle show.
From the Dave Chappelle show. All right. Well, I'll give you half credit. All right. That's like 2.5 people here with ugly sweaters.
Now, I just put on my best ugly coat. I didn't have a sweater. I'm from Texas, and it's not cold enough here for sweaters most of the time. So I had this sport coat from years ago and threw it on over this Cloudflare t-shirt. So it should make for a festive sort of decoration for the podcast. Yeah,
I like it. I'll up my game for next year, Chad. I promise.
You're not kidding. We're recording here in the middle of December. I actually flew back from Dallas yesterday, and it was like t-shirt weather. I mean, it was like 65, perfectly sunny, blue skies. I was like, what is going on here? It's snowing in New York City today. So, all right, Steve, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, John, read your LinkedIn profile. Very excited to talk to you. You have a lot of great experience in your background, but let's start at the beginning. Maybe not where you were born, obviously, but like how you got into technology. So maybe we start there. How'd you get into tech?
Well, I've always been fascinated with technology, computers, gadgets, whatever it is, toys that make noise and do things. And, you know, sort of that led me to computers in the early days. And like, I guess it was like middle school when I got my TI 99 and then later the PC. And so, you know, tinkering around with computers ever since I was a kid. And in college, you know, kind of off the back of interest in BBSs and technology like that, I actually found out about the internet, right? The internet was sort of still relatively unknown in the 80s and 90s to most people. Maybe tech people knew about it, but most other people didn't.
Did you run a BBS? Or
I ran one sort of part-time because we only had one phone line in the house. So you had to basically run the BBS
like at night.
At night. So when when nobody needed the phone and you could call a friend and say, hey, dial into my BBS. But that's about it. I never ran a full-time BBS.
I ran a Renegade BBS in Central California in the 90s. That was popular. I had to get like a second phone line and those were the good old days back before the internet. It was all very local, you know, and all the different sysops would get together and have barbecues and stuff.
It was very local, but people still sometimes dialed long distance for that kind of stuff. And I remember the whole crazy era of hacking calling cards for people to use to get free long distance. All right, that people used to do that kind of stuff to basically cheat a little bit. But you know, one of the things that pulled me into the internet was back to my nerdy roots. I was into HP calculators in that day. HP had all those programmable calculators, and I was in engineering and physics classes and needed, you know, to learn how to program that thing. And there was a BBS that was basically available via FTP. It was HP's BBS. And if you wanted to dial into it, it was in Oregon. So again, long distance, but FTP. And so I kind of saw that FTP link and had to go figure out what that was. And that's what led me down that rabbit hole of getting an account at the university on the internet and learning about Unix and starting to figure out how it all worked. And so that was sort of my entry into this industry, really.
I still keep my TI-85 on my desk. I use it whenever my kids ask a math question. It's my daily driver for helping my kids with their math.
Yeah, it's still a valuable part of our world, right? People do use those things during certain times of the year. And anyway, learned about the internet, about to graduate from college. I got a degree in accounting, by the way, so not really a technology degree, but I was still fascinated with it. Right out of school, got a job working for a company that did big IBM mainframe type mid-range systems, or AS 400s, RS 6000s kind of gear. But it wasn't my passion; it was just a job. And one of my buddies from college called me up one day and says, "Do you want to come over and work on this ISP thing that I'm building?" Because we really couldn't get internet access at that point. It wasn't readily available. At least, again, back to some national ISPs, and you could dial long distance. But we started our own ISP in the mid '90s, and that was what sort of drew me in even further. And built that up. Had dial-up accounts, ISDN accounts,
How big did
colo.
it get?
I don't know. We had maybe 10,000 customers, something like that, 12,000
That's
customers.
pretty big. Yeah.
It was a local. It wasn't, regional or national or anything, but it was local. And, back in the early days, they were paying like $50 a month. It was kind of it was
Oh man, way back then.
pretty
This was like
expensive.
That's a
early
good
Then it
deal.
went down to 20, and then it went down to 15. And then, the ISP market, changed radically in just the course of about 5 or 6 years, because people started to realize, like the telcos and the cable companies started to see the potential for it. And that really is when I jumped and went to Rackspace, because I knew I could see the writing on the wall that the ISP business was not, going to be a big thing for a local company. So one of my customers at that ISP at the time became one of the founders and investors in Rackspace. And that's what led me to join Rackspace in 2000.
so cool. So when you started at Rackspace, what were you doing? Like,
It was a true startup at that point, and they hired me as VP of operations. So that just meant I basically did a little bit of everything. I managed the customer support people, all the customer support. I managed the teams that built servers and deployed them into the data center. I managed basically all the things that were not financial or marketing, sales kind of a thing. So I was sort of the tech side of the house. There were some people that were smarter than me that actually managed the network itself, like the network engineering folks. They were on a different team under our VP of engineering, but we had a very close relationship and worked together on helping build out customers. So all the big customers that showed up really were my kind of responsibility to get them up and running and built, and the teams that I led basically did all that work.
so back then, what kind of tech did you use to monitor things and troubleshoot things? Like, was it all just manual, log in
You
each machine?
you're going to laugh. There was in the early days, we didn't really monitor things. We let customers call us and tell us,
That's fair.
something was broken, and
Yeah.
we basically supporting them in their efforts. We didn't really take full responsibility for their uptime. We took responsibility for the network and whatever. But there were customers that were starting to push us and say, "Hey, we need you to tell us when something's broken." And I downloaded what you're going to laugh, but there was a program for Windows that was called What's Up Gold. And What's Up
Oh,
Gold
I
was like
remember What's Up
this
Gold.
local little piece of software
Yeah.
that you needed to run on the desktop, and it would ping every hour. And then eventually we wrote our own tools for that stuff. But I was usually the one that just sort of figured out some quick and dirty hack to figure out how to get across some challenge, and then have to be adopted by our team to go build out a tool or a
Yeah.
platform. But there was all kinds of monitoring tools, ping and port monitoring,
Yep.
uptime, availability, pinging lots of servers on a regular basis. It's harder than it sounds. Like, really, you have to have some pretty scalable hardware to do it. So we
Yeah.
built a lot of that ourselves.
So, John, when you were growing the business, like hardware was also changing very quickly. The software on top of it was changing very quickly. What was kind of your guiding principle and how you kept up to date? Was it like you just put the new stuff next to the old stuff and maybe migrate, maybe don't?
Well, we would obviously try to keep equipment in production as long as we reasonably could, because it had to pay for itself. So you had to sort of get customers up and running, get them deployed on some hardware. A lot of the servers at Rackspace were built in-house. We built our own from components. We were not buying off the
Sure.
shelf ready to go hardware. We were
Yeah.
building a lot of that ourselves. And so we were buying the latest motherboards and
Okay.
chassis and hardware and building it. And so it was sort of this, you could kind of move across the data center, one of Rackspace's data centers, and see sort of different eras of hardware based on when a customer joined or when they got deployed. And we were dedicating hardware, dedicating an entire server to a customer. And typically the good part for us was that customers didn't want to necessarily move to the new hardware because it was a huge migration challenge. It
Yeah.
wasn't like today where you've got a VM and you can just pick it up and move it. This
Yeah.
was like, okay, we've got to migrate from this version of Linux to this version, and everything had to be compiled and everything had to be,
Yeah.
upgraded.
Retested.
It was a lot of work, right? And so people were more than happy to stay on a particular piece of hardware as long as it stayed up and it performed well.
Yeah. So when you look back at Rackspace, you were there for, I think, 17 years, almost 18 years.
Yeah.
Like, what technologies made your life the easiest? Like, is there one technology that you remember was like, man, this is amazing? And then what's one that made your life a living hell?
Okay, so easiest was when we started to actually buy hardware sort of off the shelf and buy,
Oh, okay.
these big, again, Dell servers, just sort of the
Yep.
typical 2U rack mount. I remember seeing the first one of those show up, and it was all modular and it was all easy
Yeah.
to sort of, troubleshoot and upgrade and, make changes to it was a piece of hardware in the early days of the hosting business, and I'm trying to remember what the heck the name was. It was like a 1U pizza box server that was kind of an out of the box, ready to go web server. And it was so hard to maintain. I'm going to have to look up what that machine was called. It was like a proprietary version of Linux on top of some proprietary hardware. And the customers loved it because it had this really cool control panel that made it easy for them, but it made it really hard for us. And so that was one that sticks out of my mind. And then the other is just, the other hard thing is just as customers scaled, you had more and more complexity associated with one given customer. So the hardest thing as they got big was like, okay, they've expanded beyond the bounds of one rack or one
Yep.
row of racks. And then all of a sudden you've got to play Tetris in your data center and move stuff around, right?
Yeah.
Lift them up and move them to another part of the data center to allocate more space. That was always a challenge when we got these really big customers. And you never knew when a customer was going to blow up and grow. We had some of
Yep.
those customers that went viral in the early days of the company. I always remember one that was Am I Hot or Not? Do you remember that site? Am I Hot or Not?
I remember that
So,
one.
so shout out to James Hong, the founder. He's one of my Twitter followers or friends, and him and his friend brought this site to Rackspace, and it just blew up. And it, in a kind of a crazy viral way. But there
Yeah.
were other. Before we got on the show here, we were talking about favorite movies, and I said Anchorman. Will
Yeah.
Ferrell. He was one of the guys behind Funny or Die, right? The
Oh, that's
website
right.
Funny or Die. That was a big viral sensation on the Rackspace platform.
Yeah.
YouTube was another one that showed up at our doorstep in the early days. The credit
Oh, is that where
card and
YouTube started? Was on
yeah,
Rackspace?
I
I
didn't
did
yeah,
know
not
that.
know
it
that.
started at Rackspace, and
So cool.
basically, they needed infrastructure for the brains of YouTube, and
Yeah.
then the truth is, even one host was not enough for YouTube, so they had infrastructure at data centers all over the world.
Okay.
But we were sort of the brains. We were where the databases were and the actual main website was. But they were serving content all over the place.
That's super cool. So back in
Yeah.
the early days before you had like virtualization and easy ways to fail over, what happened when things went wrong? Like the power went out or you got a power surge? Like what would you guys do?
We had some of that. That was not unknown territory. There was a time in one of our data centers when the air conditioners were not functioning properly and machines were starting to overheat. And I remember our VP of data center engineering was going to basically go smash out Windows. Our data center had Windows, by the way. Most data centers do not have
Yeah,
Windows.
they don't.
This was early days. It was in a high rise office building, and
Yeah.
it did have Windows all the way around, and the air conditioners failed, but the machines were still on. And like he was panicking, like, okay, we don't have that much time
Yeah.
because these things are going to start to melt. And so he was threatening to go smash out Windows. It wouldn't have helped, honestly, because you needed a
No.
lot more cooling than that. What else happened? We did build redundancy. You remember the days of having a failover redundant pair of firewalls or load balancers or even servers. You had these sort of architectures that were supposed to be more resilient, but they rarely functioned as promised, right? That usually you ended up with a failover that caused more problems than it solved. And so we did try to build that for customers, but a lot of times, we were just scrappy kind of folks that just did things with a lot of humans. We were running into the data center. We had people positioned with these crash carts so that we could go out into the data center and sort of plug in a console and troubleshoot it right there. Sometimes the machine wouldn't boot. Sometimes it was On Windows machine, it would do a blue screen. You had to figure out what the heck was going on with that. And sometimes it was just human intervention, right? It was like, do what you can to get things back up and running. The bigger problems that were more outside of the scope of an individual, we had to figure out, larger scale solutions to those things. And we did have our share of issues over the years, but fun stories.
Yeah, seriously, we could probably talk about this all day. All right. So you're at Rackspace for almost 18 years, and then you left and started doing a few different things. Like you
Well, hold on,
joined a
hold on.
board.
Before,
Go ahead.
before we go forward, like
Yeah.
obviously Rackspace was a major player at the time in the hosting world and very successful. Obviously, all these big websites that you were mentioning that came up through there. But at some point, things crossed over and people started moving to the cloud, to AWS, to wherever, right, Azure, et cetera. And those guys are much bigger businesses than Rackspace is now. So I'm curious, was it just an innovator's dilemma type of problem happening at Rackspace at the time, where they didn't want to start selling servers by the second or by the hour because it would cannibalize the existing business, and then that opened a door for Amazon to really come in? Or like, what were
Well,
you seeing there at the time?
we were certainly paying attention to Amazon. It was not like we didn't understand the threat or the opportunity. You can look at it in two ways. I mean, at that time they were coming at it from, I think they launched the queuing service, they launched S3, they launched EC2, they launched a few things sort of in
Yeah.
order. In the early days when we first saw that, it was like, this is pretty interesting stuff. This is like, worth exploring, worth thinking about. And yet at the same time, we were not seeing it as an immediate threat because the big enterprise customers were still demanding large scale hardware, redundancy, things that were sort of more bulletproof. I call it like the gold plated hardware. They wanted a SAN with redundancy. They wanted a NAS with redundancy. They wanted large scale enterprisey type equipment. They wanted to see your data center. They wanted to tour.
Dedicated stuff. Yeah,
They
that's
wanted
right. Go inside and walk
let's
around.
tour the facility and make sure it's compliant with all these standards and whatever. And so at the early stages of AWS, none of that stuff existed, right? And people were not 100% sure, certainly not enterprises, how they were supposed to use that stuff. So you could see it in the context of maybe a smaller startup that, was engineering their own product and could control everything. But you couldn't see it as these larger companies. So we started tinkering with it. I had a customer early days of Rackspace that came to me and said, "Do you have anything like S3?" And I said, "Well, no, not exactly." But we put some people on working on that, and we ended up building a prototype for a distributed storage platform that eventually led to us launching the OpenStack
OpenStack. Yeah.
project.
Mhm.
So we were embracing the idea of cloud. We bought a company that was called SliceHost. SliceHost was a by the month virtual server rental kind of company, not by the hour, not by the minute, but they were sort of taking servers that were physical and slicing them up and carving off a piece of it and renting it by the month. That company got folded into Rackspace, and we built out the Rackspace cloud. And I think that we did do a pretty good job. There were a lot of people that used that cloud product at that time. The challenge was it's just the scale of AWS was so big. They were spending in a quarter to build out data centers. They were spending our revenue for a year, right? I mean, they were just a different scale of beast at that time. And it's, certainly only gotten bigger and bigger, but the velocity they had was hard to match. And so we sort of always went back to the strengths of the company in terms of our support. We used to have this thing called fanatical support, which was basically do anything the customer needed, kind of do everything that we could to make sure that they were successful. I remember talking to one of our third shift engineers overnight. He said, "I've logged into people's AWS servers and fixed things for them. And they're not even on Rackspace floor. There's not on our data center floor. They're in AWS, but they were integrated with our cloud and our server infrastructure." And so we were supporting some of that. And I think that's really where we always leaned is how do we make, the customers' lives a little easier? How do we support them? And to this day, that's what Rackspace is doing, is helping people move to cloud, get to cloud. I've not been involved for many years, so I don't want to speak like I know what's going on inside the company, but it's a great story of like sticking to sort of your roots and doing what you do best and not trying to be something that you aren't. But they did a good job at continuing down that path of supporting customers and serving the needs of these companies that were trying to embrace new technology at the leading edge.
Yeah. John, when AWS started, it felt like they were really targeting developers and like, simple queuing service, stuff like that. Did you guys ever talk about how you could build like developer first services at Rackspace? Was that a thing?
Yeah, and we did. And some of the products in that cloud context allowed you to, push a template to the cloud and just deploy a database and a web server and a MySQL or Postgres at the time
Yeah.
that we
A
were
lamp stack,
a
probably.
LAMP stack. And we did build developer centric services. The OpenStack platform itself really spoke to people that wanted to build their own clouds for a developer audience. And, the developer mindset, it kind of was intertwined at the time with the startup. Startups and developers kind of went together. The most forward leaning developers were sort of in that startup space, and you really had to lead with documentation. That was kind of
Yeah.
the way you marketed to a developer community, is like by having really good docs and having really good a way to sort of engage them. And so putting a little bit of code on your website, I mean, you remember these days, like that was sort of the way you enticed a developer
Yep.
to check out your platform, is just make it super easy, make an entry point
Yeah.
that made it dead simple for them to get started. And we did try to build in the cloud at Rackspace the simplest way to spin up a server or to take advantage of that infrastructure. We want to make it super simple, so that was part of it as well.
I remember basically every bank in New York was either building out or looking at building out an OpenStack platform so that they could have, EC2 APIs and S3 APIs internally
Yep.
with in their own infrastructure. And it feels like they've all just acquiesced and said, all right, we're just going to use the actual cloud now.
Yeah.
For the vast majority of things, it's just one. And so I've been listening to a lot of Reid Hoffman lately. He was on a recent episode of Diary of the CEO, which is a podcast I watch, but I've watched all of his blitz scaling videos on YouTube. And
I mean, I think what we could have done is, again, try to build at that scale, go faster, but again, you can't do it if it's not in your DNA. I mean, we didn't really have an army of software engineers at Rackspace at the time. We were sort of mostly data center engineers, network engineers, system administrators. We were kind of a different animal. And so what I think what we should have done earlier is just embrace the idea that people were going to be multi-cloud and put our arms around sort of supporting or in helping make that more practical sooner, right? And a lot of people struggled. I mean, even the best software engineers are not always good in terms of keeping things running or making things work at sort of a large scale systems, distributed systems kind of scale. And we had some expertise there. I mean, building these big, complicated deployments. The other thing we used to do quite well every Christmas, this time of year, we would build out massive amounts of server infrastructure for whatever Xbox game was about to launch that Christmas, right? Every game developer needed tons of infrastructure. And then in the pre-cloud era, this was a challenge, right? How did you get all that infrastructure for Christmas Day? And then how do you taper it off after Christmas? And we had lots of experience and expertise at building out those systems in a physical world. And it wasn't that much of a jump into the virtual. In fact, it made our lives a lot easier. And I think we should have just leveraged that and sort of went out and told that story of embracing all the other clouds instead of sort of fighting with them, but really going and making them easier to adopt sooner.
Yeah.
Rackspace eventually did that, but it was not, I don't think, the right timing necessarily, a little late.
Yeah, and it's hard to grow that fast. Actually, I heard a story this morning that I hadn't heard him say before, but he was saying that something he learned at Uber was that anytime Uber would hire somebody, they would ask them, who are the 3 best people that you work with at your current company? And they would just automatically extend them offers without even doing interviews. And that was
It's
one
a
of the ways that they blitzscaled.
good
I
way
was
to
like,
do it.
that's
Good way to do
amazing.
it.
I hadn't heard that before. It's a great
Yeah.
story. Yeah, and companies still struggle to do multi-cloud stuff. I still see it. It's very, very hard to
And
do. They haven't
everybody
figured it
has
out.
that problem. I mean,
Yeah.
I did a panel the other day with some CISO CIOs at a conference, and I had raise your hand if you're in more than 2 clouds, and most of them, almost all of them, were in multiple clouds, and then connecting into SaaS platforms and API integrations and lots of complexity, right? I mean, everybody is dealing with lots of moving parts, and I feel like it's only getting more complicated, right? I mean, we're now living in this distributed world where we work from home. All of us are sitting in a home office. We're traveling all over the world and trying to continue to do business. The internet is now the backbone of modern commerce and modern business. I mean, that's really what, if you want to know what led me to Cloudflare, it's basically the idea that the world has changed, right? We are not in centralized data centers. We are not in headquarters buildings. The network is no longer private and controllable. It's sort of this Wild West uncontrolled world. And so how do you wrap some sanity and some control and some visibility around that? And that's what I think I see in Cloudflare's platform that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, so you left Rackspace and you went to Cloudflare, which I think it's a fascinating company because I remember hearing about it. Well, even before it started, I remember going to Standards Body meeting in New Hampshire in 2005, and they had invited, the keynote speaker was the CEO and the creator of Akamai. And he gave a really just brilliant keynote talk about Akamai's network and how CDNs work and how they protect denial of service attacks and all this stuff. And of course, they were the dominant player. They were the first, they basically created that market and they were the dominant player. And so when I heard that Cloudflare was launching, and I had a friend who worked there in the very early days, Will Dinkle, who had actually been on this podcast earlier, our podcast a few episodes ago. He went to work there, I think, when he was doing his Harvard MBA. I think he was an intern there. And I just remember thinking, what a stupid business to start, because what you're going to attack Akamai, this giant leader who's built this thing and already figured it out. And what are you going to do that's better than what they did? And man, was I wrong. Because they absolutely built something amazing and dominated. Of course, it's much bigger than that now, but it's just a brilliant company.
Yeah, it is a great story, great company, great people behind it. I got to know Cloudflare when I was at Rackspace. In the early days, I met the founders out in Silicon Valley, one of those developer conferences or investor conferences or whatever I was doing. And I met them in the very early days. Actually had a guy that I hired at Rackspace ended up joining Cloudflare in the very early days as well. He was one of their smartest engineers and knew how to make DNS work and all the things that you needed to scale at that time. And I paid attention to the company for many years. I spoke at one of their early conferences. I met Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the web. I met him at a Cloudflare conference, so it was kind of cool to have dinner with him. But I paid attention to the company for many years and saw what they were doing. And I didn't go straight from Rackspace to Cloudflare. So in the interim, I joined a company called NTT, which is this big Japanese telco, and I did some large scale deployments of SD-WAN and some things that were really transforming enterprises. And there is where I saw even more potential for what Cloudflare was building, because they started, like you said, helping scale websites, helping make websites perform better, helping defend them from attacks. That was sort of the origin of the platform. They later added SSL, made SSL easy to adopt, sort of made it a default thing on the Cloudflare network so that people get security on their website, make it super simple. And then over the years, just lots and lots more products and services that are layered in. But after the pandemic, or even during the pandemic, I just saw the potential for what their platform was becoming gradually. I mean, not just protecting websites, but protecting end users as well. So it's a large proxy and it goes both ways, right? You put traffic in and proxy it through Cloudflare for websites. That means helping scale them. On the other end of the platform, the reverse proxy is sort of from an end user perspective. How do you defend them from all the threats and all the things that might land on their desktop via the internet? And zero trust and that sort of architecture of replacing that legacy VPN infrastructure and using our Cloudflare's network as the entry point to secure that traffic. And when you have sort of both ends of it, you really have some power, because now you can optimize traffic across that network. So I'm sitting here in my home office going through Cloudflare Zero Trust platform, through our edge, through one of the local points of presence that's nearby, and connecting into, what are we using? StreamYard. I don't know if they're a customer or not, but lots of people are customers of Cloudflare on the SaaS platform side of things. And so therefore you have this really nice path between, the origin and the user. And, we can optimize that. We can make it, we have this mission statement at Cloudflare to help build a better internet. And it doesn't mean build another internet. It just means make the internet better for the kinds of use cases that people want to use it for. And today, business relies so heavily on it. In my early days, nobody cared if the internet was down for a few minutes. But now, if it has a blip, people care a lot, right? And they care if it has, so many threats out. Threat landscape is so sophisticated that people need to start to figure out how to defend against all the kinds of attacks that are going on. And I think that's really where we shine.
Does that mean that, like, if I use Cloudflare, if I'm a customer, that my services will actually be faster because you're able to optimize those pathways between, or the tubes, I should say?
They can be, yeah, the tubes, the inner
Yeah.
tubes. If you are curious about the Cloudflare architecture, one of the things that I tell people when I meet them for the first time, and how it helps me sort of explain what Cloudflare is, because it's hard to put it in one sentence.
Yeah.
But if you go to our speed test website, speed.cloudflare.com, anybody can do this. And it has a little map about halfway down the page, and the map will show you how you are connecting into the Cloudflare network. And it'll tell you kind of where you are on the planet and where the nearest point of presence is. And it's not always physical geography, but sometimes it's based on routing, right? BGP and how you're routing with your upstream ISP. But the advantage is once we get you to the one of those edge locations, we can control routing across that network. We can improve routing between you and whatever services that we happen to be interconnected with. And we're highly interconnected, with ISP peering arrangements, with network operators, cloud operators, data center infrastructure operators. All those people are peered with Cloudflare. And then on top of that, we have our own fiber backbone that interconnects many of the locations around the world. And so I have found there is potential for us to improve the performance. I was doing a demo at a bank one time, and we were on the bank's Wi-Fi, and they were shocked that the entire conference I was doing, like, a Zoom call or a Teams call or whatever it was, and I was sitting there on their Wi-Fi, and the whole time we were going through the Cloudflare network, and they said, "This is better than we get, sort of normally. And so what are you doing?" And I showed them the routing, and so yeah, that map you just passed up there, I think, is really the key there. So it's showing you're in New York area, and you're connecting into maybe a point of presence there in New Jersey. It looks like Newark.
Yeah,
And
I'm surprised there isn't one in Long Island or Manhattan closer, though. That's interesting.
When you zoom out on that, is there any other orange dots around you there?
How far do I got to? Philadelphia and Boston. Looks like Philly and Boston are the next closest ones. So Newark must be your big New York City headquarters, which is not uncommon. Everybody has servers out in Jersey right across the river.
And it looks like Verizon's your network provider there. So you're basically going to route to Cloudflare based on what Verizon and Cloudflare agree in terms of BGP. So the IP address of Cloudflare is basically announced the same everywhere, but your ISP is doing some fancy BGP routing table negotiations with Cloudflare, and that BGP Anycast gets you to the closest one,
right,
to where you are. But that's the network. Again, all the services that we offer run at all those locations, and it gives us the ability to do some really clever things near where the users are. We can stop DDoS attacks near where they begin before they make their way across the network. So a lot of times an ISP in some South America or Asia or Pacific Islands or something, they like Cloudflare being nearby because it absorbs the attack before it clogs their pipes, right? And so we can stop those attacks right near the edge. And now again, when you turn our network in reverse, we can also apply policies to how users and their devices connect into the Cloudflare network. And so you get the concept of zero trust security being applied right there in those data centers to, like, my laptop sitting here. I'm going through that same architecture, and they can control through policies, identity and policy and all kinds of different characteristics, what I'm allowed to do, where I'm allowed to go, and not really expose anything that I'm not supposed to see to a threat actor who might want to take over my machine.
You guys have a product called Cloudflare Tunnels, which was kind of directly competitive to Ngrok, where I was the field CTO previously. And this was really the only competitor that I kind of worried about. Obviously, you're scaled. So we were trying to out innovate, because we were small, we could ship new features very rapidly. But I'm curious, one of the, I don't say, like, it was almost like running uphill from an enterprise point of view, because there was this headwind we were facing in that market, which was that it got identified by various scanning tools as something that hackers would use, right? Because a hacker would just run an Ngrok tunnel, or the equivalent of a Cloudflare tunnel, right, inside of a corporate firewall, and then use it to tunnel out and as a launching off point. I'm curious, is that something that you guys face with Cloudflare tunnels too?
Well, I think that there is always something that, when you're in an innovative segment of the market, whatever it is, there's always going to be use cases that people figure out what to do with something that you didn't necessarily predict or couldn't have predicted. And I think, you're trying to innovate, you're trying to build something that solves a problem, and then perhaps it creates a problem, right? So those are things that I think every innovative company deals with on quite a regular basis. We are aware of organizations from time to time that, the threat actors that use Cloudflare infrastructure for various purposes, and we try to shut them down if we can. And when we identify them, we have great mechanism for reporting all that kind of abuse on our network, and we embrace the idea of having those reports make their way into our platform so that we can do something about it. And we have people that are tasked with investigating and making sure that people are not abusing us and not abusing our customers. And it's a difficult challenge at times, because we do serve such a wide range of customers. You were talking about one of our competitors, and they had, in some ways, the luxury of only dealing with customers that were of a certain scale or size, right? But I think Cloudflare has tried to bring all of our products from the very low end of the market in terms of customers that maybe use Cloudflare for free, all the way up to the largest customers in the world that pay us millions of dollars, right? And so when you have that range of customers, you have to take some good with some bad. The good is that we see threats that the other people would never see, because they're coming through the Cloudflare network. They're maybe hackers trying to test some new attack mechanism or whatever, and we get an early look at it, versus somebody who is waiting for it to mature into a much more capable weapon, right? And so we saw last year, I think it was the HTTP2 rapid reset bug that manifested, and Cloudflare was the one that discovered it, basically, and we shared it with all of our competitors and all the people in the ecosystem, and basically told them how it was going to play out, because we were already seeing it much earlier because of our free customers, the people that use us sometimes for all kinds of interesting use cases.
Yeah, I think the Cloudflare blog, which talks about all the any sort of attack that you guys have mitigated, or analysis of it, or even just new technologies like HTTP3 coming out. I mean, most people are still not even on HTTP2 yet, and you guys are already deploying HTTP3. You guys are very forward thinking, and I think the write-ups that you guys post are really very, very detailed.
The blog is the most enticing thing about sort of, you mentioned hiring your next three closest, I guess, best engineers or whatever. I think our blog is the net that captures people's attention. And, engineers love to read, analyze what we see across our network. They love to understand it. And, even I wake up in the morning, the first thing I do is go to the Cloudflare blog to see what we've published, because there are people publishing that from all different pockets of the company. It's not like it's the marketing website. It is literally the engineering website. People that actually are running these systems and scaling these platforms and diagnosing these bugs and understanding the kernel challenges that underpin Linux for us. It's an interesting blog even for me to sort of wake up to. And so I encourage everybody to check that out for sure. I think today did a blog post on the
MCP.
Anthropic. Yeah, the MCP,
Yeah.
the model context.
Yeah.
I always think of that as the master control program from Tron. MCP is
I mean, it may become that based on what it
that's
does.
my brain. That's where it goes to is MCP from Tron. But model context protocol is, and that, it's like literally the week after Anthropic announced that, or maybe not even a week, a couple of days later, I think it was around Thanksgiving, our team had already built out an MCP connector for Cloudflare's developer platform and was making that available. And I was tinkering around with that. And, it's just really interesting to see all the things that people are doing, both internally and then from time to time externally with the Cloudflare platform.
Well, hey, let's talk about field CTO, CTO, and then I want to talk about AI, which will bring us right back to this blog probably. So, John, you were CTO at Rackspace for a long time. You're now field CTO at Cloudflare. Like, help me understand the difference in those two roles and what you like about field CTO.
At Rackspace, CTO was different at different stages of the company. So in the early days, I was much more hands-on in the data center, on the network, building things, helping architect, scale, whatever. As we grew, as the company grew, as the reach of the company grew, I became much more external focused, and I started to have to go do speeches, and I had to go do stand on stage with Microsoft and do a partnership, announcement of some sort. Or I was speaking to investors when we went public in 2008. They wanted to talk about all the things that were tech details of the platform and understand what we were all about. So CTO was different for me at different stages of the company. And I see that at different companies as well. I meet a lot of folks, and CTO sometimes is different at different companies. Sometimes it's a software job, sometimes it's a hardware job, sometimes it's communications job, and it's all of those things. And you have to be okay with that if you want to be a CTO, because they kind of throw you into anything. It's not a super, super well-defined role. It's more of like, you have to fill in for what the company needs at any given time. And so I learned that, and I sort of just embraced it. I just said, let me be the person that volunteers to go speak at these events or engage with customers. I traveled all around the world. I went to the White House twice with Rackspace.
Oh, wow.
All kinds of crazy engagements. And it's very hard to say what that CTO role should have been. I just made it whatever it needed to be at the time.
Yeah.
And so I did the same kind of a thing at NTT. I did sort of a
Yeah, you
customer
were
facing CTO
market
client. They had a word
yeah,
client CTO, same thing, customer facing.
Yeah.
And it's really only in certain companies they want to distinguish it because they don't want people to be confused about what you're doing. Like, I'm not writing code for Cloudflare. I'm not
yeah,
telling the engineers how to build a piece of technology, but I am an important interface between how our customers are using the platform and how our teams are engineering the platform to meet their needs. And so I'm kind of a bridge between the outside world and the inside world. And so field, I just say it sort of means I'm outside the company more than I'm inside. I travel a lot. I go speak to customers. I go to conferences. I try to have dinner with as many of our customers as I can just to hear the real use cases.
Yep.
And I try to translate for them what we're doing into their world and vice versa. And so that's what field CTO means to me. You do some writing, you do some speaking, you do some whatever needs doing in that context.
Yep, that's fair. I think when I became field CTO at Elastic, part of it felt like you had earned the trust of the founder, and you were now helping the founder scale because they can't be everywhere at once. And so
That's
they
exactly
trusted
right.
you enough to take the vision out there, and then Red Stapler style, bring the requirements back from the customer. No, just kidding. But
And I think that's a guiding principle. If you're a field CTO, you sort of have to think in the back of your mind, what would our founders say if they were standing here in front of this customer? How would they want to convey the vision and the mission and the purpose and the technology of the company and the passion of the people behind the company and all the positive things that you want to get across to your customer so that they understand what they're getting involved in, because they're investing as a platform for a long-term period of time, right? They have to make a bet on your company, your technology, not just for one day or week or month, but it's years potentially. And so you have to give them the context and the feel. And I think that's what a field CTO can do.
that's right. How are you guys organized? Is it a team of field CTOs? And
Yeah, we have a team. We have more than one. There are people with different areas of background. I think, I come from this hosting data center cloud background. We have some that are cybersecurity background. We have some that sort of have affinities, so to speak, with different technology stacks, if you will. Cybersecurity is one that's obviously grown for Cloudflare. Historically, we really didn't have the chief security officer as our customer. It was more like the web team or the digital team. When you're selling a product that is the replacement for the VPN and it enforces zero trust security principles at the edge and all, now you have to start having conversations with the CISO, maybe the VP of engineering, whoever runs the network, different people in the organization. And so the field CTO has to be sort of in tune with the dynamics in the customer as well. Like, you have to start to understand how to cross over from one side of the business to another. And, your authenticity helps you there because you can connect with them on things that you have in common. These people, they have a long background in technology just like you do. And so if you can find places where you have common ground and trust, you can build trust. It's all about trust. I mean, a field CTO cannot be somebody who walks in and is pushy about a product or whatever. It's for the long term, it's for the big picture, it's for making sure that the customer has a trusted advisor inside the company and is looking out for them. And I think that's the key to this role.
I think that's totally right. Your background's not cybersecurity, and I'm curious, what's that knowledge ramp been like for you? I imagine you're learning something every day about new threats and how that all works. You feel like you're getting to the point now where you can talk to a CISO no problem? And
Well, I can talk to them, but I still don't pretend like I'm a cybersecurity person because I don't have that background. When you really come through that career path, oftentimes I remember being here in San Antonio, Texas, all the security folks were ex-military or ex-Air Force. We have the Air Force Cyber Command over here in San Antonio, Texas, and all the companies around here that did their startups were literally ex-Air Force security officers that were basically learning how to now go build companies, right? And they spoke in acronyms that I just did not know. I didn't come from that background, and they love the language of cybersecurity is very different. And so I never really tried to pretend that I wasn't something I wasn't, but I always used my strengths and my background and my knowledge to try to engage with them in a way, again, that's very authentic. And so I would go back to the early days of my time when I realized that security was just not a thing on the internet. We didn't have firewalls, we didn't have encryption, we didn't have really anything in the ISP days. You could see passwords across the wire. If you had a sniffer, you could just see all of it in clear text. And so the internet itself, to me, was something that needed to evolve in terms of security. And yes, we did all those things in the early days, putting firewalls in front of infrastructure, but it's just a journey, right? And no one is going to be the expert on all the things, right? No one can be. And you need to complement yourself with people that can fill in those gaps. And I think even with a chief security officer, when you sit across the table, they know that they're not in control of everything. They have a particular mandate. The CEO, the board of directors, the people inside the company know what they're supposed to do, but there's a lot that's outside their control. And so I'm trying to figure out how we, kind of dovetail into their world and augment their capabilities and give them back kind of the visibility and control that they need to do their job effectively.
All right. Well, hey, let's move into the AI conversations.
Before we go into AI, I have a forward-thinking question, which is, I think that the AI conversation is going to be very long, so I don't want to run out of time. And maybe this question it doesn't have a good answer, but I'm just curious on your thoughts. When the internet was created, it was meant to be this very decentralized network of networks. No one controlled everything. Governments weren't in charge of it, all of that. And obviously over the decades, it's become more and more centralized, both as companies have just merged with each other, but also governments have done things that we know of through leaks where, ISPs have to funnel traffic through government servers so they can kind of listen to things. And different countries will do that differently, right? Do you think that there is any sort of existential threat to the internet as we know it? Like or is there going to be a new generation of the internet? Is the internet 2 going to take off? Are people going to build a new replacement internet that doesn't have the restrictions and sort of the centralization of the current one? I mean, no technology lasts forever. So what are thought leaders in the networking space? And maybe, it's not good for the big companies like Cloudflare and Amazon to have a separate internet because it's, their business is built on the existing one. But is there something that's going to replace it? What will be the downfall of the internet?
There's a lot of questions in that. I think, first of all, we do like the idea of one internet. In fact, Cloudflare as a company continues to use a capital I in internet instead of like the prevailing sort of lowercase I. I don't know when that happened, but I always use capital I for internet because there's only one, right? There's only one internet, or there should only be one. We watch what's going on around the world, obviously through the lens of our network. We have insights into things that are happening, on the internet in different parts of the world. If you go look on our blog, recently we published our 2024 year in review of all the things that we saw in terms of outages, in terms of places where governments are blocking internet access. An interesting dynamic is during exam season in certain countries, they shut off the internet for kids taking exams because they don't want cheating to happen. So they just shut down the whole internet. Could you imagine if the US government shut down the whole internet during SAT week or whatever? I mean, but that literally is it happens. And they shut down the internet. They also shut down the internet when they're going through some sort of political strife. Election season we just passed. Cloudflare was involved in protecting lots of election websites, candidate websites, trying to keep things up and running, because when things get shut off is when people go sort of dark and they have no visibility. They start to panic a little bit, like, what's going on? This is how we communicate. And if you shut off people's way of communicating, it becomes a real problem. And if people sense instability in the institutions that power their lives, they start to panic as well. And so protecting the internet is part of our mission. And we have to do that within the context of the law. And the law is different in countries all around the world. We can't break the law. We can't go against a local or regional or country kind of regulation. We have to sort of navigate that in an interesting kind of way. There's nothing behind that statement. It is what it is. We have a very difficult job in operating all around the world in ways that adhere to all these different laws. And so we have a huge team of people that have to figure that stuff out and refigure it out because it changes all the time. And you asked about multiple internets. There are different ways of managing the internet in different countries. We can see it in a few pockets around the world where they have a very tight level of control around what you can do and where you can go and what you can see and what sites can operate. And then you have other countries that are much more free about it. And I know that that's going to continue to be a thing, because as countries want to preserve their power, as leaders in countries want to preserve their power, sometimes they lean in that direction of getting a much more tight control over what is being shared on social media. Social media is such a big part of our lives now. We're seeing that dynamic play out in the news around the elections as well, that it has a bigger role in a presidential election than ever before. And you can imagine that certain countries, they just don't want that. They don't want to have that problem. They're just going to deal with it with a very tight clamp around the internet. And that just leads to the potential for the balkanization, I think is the word they like to use, where you've got different parts of the world that operate differently. And I don't know if I have a strong opinion on how that should be managed. I would like to be in a world where the internet is free and open and available to everybody at sort of a level playing field. I like that idea. I grew up building the internet in the spirit of this should be a way we should all communicate, think about using it for our daily lives. I love that idea, but the stakes are much higher as we continue to do more with it. And therefore people have more of an interest in wrapping control around it, right? And I don't know where that leads. I don't know if I can look in the crystal ball and tell you where it's going, but I can tell you that Cloudflare is going to have a role in that. We're going to be involved in it. We're going to try to explain what needs to be explained to people so that they can make the right decisions around these things, or at least the decisions that are fully informed, and when needed, we can all get involved and make our voices heard around the things that we value as consumers of the internet as well.
I just think, no technology lasts forever. The internet's amazing in that it's been around for like 40 or 50 years. Still, it basically, there's a lot of new protocols and whatever, but it's basically what it was. And I'm just curious what will kill it. Because something will always out innovate it and replace it. Like nothing lasts forever. So I don't know what it will be. I don't know if it'll be some peer-to-peer thing. People just setting up like wireless things from rooftop to rooftop in cities, and they just make their own completely separate network. I don't know if it'll be Starlink, launching its own separate internet, from space or something. I don't know.
Starlink's doing interesting stuff. That's another thing that got reported in our report for the end of the year, is just the uptick in how many people are using Starlink and where they're using it from. And it's crazy to think about, we're shifting from fiber internet to space-based internet. And but it's both. It's not going to be one or the other. And I think you're right. It could be we extend into another technology platform or another way. I don't think necessarily when I hear the word internet, it necessarily means a particular type of technology, because it's more of a concept. It's like connecting all the things, right? Connecting devices and people and doing it. I don't think there's any reason the internet couldn't be on some other technology platform, wireless or lasers or something else that we dream up in some point. But it is the way that we connect everyone, sort of all over the world. And as long as we want to have that as a goal, then the internet, at least as an idea, can continue to shape what we go build as technologists.
Yeah, I would like to see one that was completely decentralized and that no government could meddle in, and literally gave people the ability to do what the original vision was. I don't know if that will ever happen, but I hope it does.
It'd be nice to think about how to do something like that to keep it alive but again, anybody that is in some physical jurisdiction somewhere is always going to have a government that wants to enforce some sort of control around it. And so even if we build a network that they can't touch, it still lands on your desktop somehow, right? It either over the airwaves or through the space that they control. So they'll exert some sort of control somehow, right? And that's just the reality of life on planet Earth.
Maybe.
I feel like the content will have a gravitational effect too. Like, depending on who has the content you want, there are multiple internets. That's going to be how you decide, right? Then there's going to have to be a connector that brings them all together for you. So it's very simple. And it's like, we're just right back where we started.
Yeah.
All right, Chad, that was a great question. When you were talking about it, I was thinking about my experience driving in LA. When you enter Orange County, you can tell, like, because the freeway's nicer.
Oh, yeah.
That's my first observation of, oh yeah, I must be in Orange County now. Anyway, so John, let's talk about AI. Like, I'm curious. I figured we'd take an approach where we talk about how you're using it personally, and then talk about how it's being leveraged at Cloudflare, and like go up from there. So we'll end with kind of the implications and where we think this is all going as best we can. So how are you using it personally in your life, if at all?
I am using it all the time and for a variety of purposes. I certainly use it as a thought partner. You asked about something a minute ago about having a thought partner in the field CTO function. But I think a field CTO and you're sitting in your home office and you don't have anybody to sort of think with, it's a little bit of a challenge, right? And so I sometimes will lean on AI to help me think through interesting things to talk about or interesting things to weave together a story for a presentation or something like that. I'll have it help me, make, some talking points for a particular slide or a presentation just to kind of organize my thoughts, right? It just helps me sometimes my own thoughts reflected back to me in bullet points, even if they're literally the same thing I just said. It's like, okay, well, now it makes sense because you've organized it slightly different or whatever. So I use it all the time for that.
Is that ChatGPT or what's your daily driver?
Well, it depends on the day of the week. It seems like because I'm flipping between different models, right? So ChatGPT was the original, and I still use it. Claude certainly is very capable. Google is coming on strong with Gemini and some of their new models. I have literally LLM. There's a local piece of software that you run on your machine. It's called LLM, so it's confusing as hell. But you run it at the command line. So LLM can connect to either local models that you run on your machine, or it can connect to models that are hosted via API, even Cloudflare's Edge. We have our own models that we host on our own network that we can connect to as well. And so I use them in sort of different contexts depending on kind of what I'm doing. And then also because of my job, trying to sort of explore what's new always, I also use different LLMs, not just necessarily because they're the best one, but because maybe they're the new one or because they're the one that just popped onto the scene and I want to see what it's capable of or how it's different or whatever. And so I'll pivot between all of those different models and even sometimes explore tools that are not LLMs themselves, but are integrated with LLMs on the back end. And so I tried out a platform called u.com the other day. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of u.com, but it's basically a layer that seems to be, I don't know if they've trained their own LLMs or what, but they have some pretty capable research tools. So like if you, before all the LLMs had access to go look at the internet and sort of see websites and whatever, this tool would basically go out and look at maybe 50 or 60 different websites and do a little research before it answered for you. And then the answers would be much richer versus just answering out of the LLM directly. And I don't know, I think some of the other guys have embraced that concept as well. I think you can do that now with the O model of ChatGPT, and Claude can talk to the internet now. And so I think that all of them are catching up. That's also a dynamic, is sort of this, when you think about all these different models, what are the differences between them, and kind of keeping up with that is a bit of a full-time job, trying to sort of understand the distinctions between them and the capabilities.
Yeah, it's really excited me. It's like poured gasoline on my curiosity because I find myself just asking a lot more questions than I normally would have in Google, which is exciting. And I've also been using it for understanding the research papers that are coming out fast and furious, right? Like the latest one I just learned about was one called Edge to Vec. It's about how to take, graph edges and nodes and convert them to vectors. I'm learning about that right now. And the papers, it's complicated. I'm not a scientist. Like I didn't go to university, so I'm sure I missed some stuff there, but it's really fun to be able to use these things to ask PDFs a question. So I've done that. Like I've taken some of the financial things I've signed over the years and been like, hey, should I have signed this?
Using YouTube videos as source material. Like, if you want to use a YouTube video, I think you can do that directly on Gemini, like just paste the URL in and have it sort of take the transcript of a video and bring that into the context. But before that was possible, I was using my own Python scripts to download the video and strip out the audio and convert the audio to MP3 and then transcribe the audio into text into a JSON file. And then basically, just have a little workflow to help me accelerate the synthesis of data sources. And you said papers. Papers are a great way to learn, but a lot of times they're not approachable because you have all this language that you read that is very scientific. The PhDs want to write that way because that's part of their vernacular. They write intentionally so that normal humans can't read that stuff. And so you get an LLM to sort of parse that for you and explain it in terms that you can kind of use to connect it with other things in your world. And all of a sudden, now you've got an idea for something new that you want to go write or you want to go put into a presentation or this future state of agentic AI where, we have agents that are doing things on our behalf.
Yep.
The other day I was thinking about how we at Cloudflare tend to group things in, humans to machines and machines to machines. And now we're going to have humans to machines, right? This layer of like a proxy in between us as humans and then our agents are doing things on our behalf. It's going to complicate the world in terms of what is a good bot and what is a bad bot, and how do you stop bots from doing things that you don't want them to do but allow them to do the things that you do want them to do. And what is a bot? If it's an agent of a human, is that a human or is it something else? And so it's bound to make things more complicated very quickly here as AI evolves and develops. So I'm just trying to keep my head around what that is going to look like and how people are using these tools. And I watch a lot of YouTube because that's where, a lot of new stuff gets shared first. And AI, there's a vibrant community around that there. And the more you watch, the more you get. So it just becomes this sort of rabbit hole that you go down.
Yeah, I was reading I think it was a blog from the Slack team. It might have been all up Salesforce, but they were talking about the future plans for Slack and what it's going to become. And they were saying something about how, you could have all these little AI agents interacting with you in Slack and kind of your little virtual assistant. And then they went on to say something about how it could go to meetings for you and, be your emissary. And I was like, eventually my AI agents are going to start asking me to do things on their behalf. So I was like, got to be careful with this, because next thing you know, I'm getting asked to do all these things. It's like, who's asking this? Who's behind this AI that's asking?
No, those agents need to write their own agents to do that stuff.
That's right.
But you're right.
Figure it out.
Salesforce is kind of going all in on this idea of agents, and they have Agent Force, and they're kind of building all this infrastructure for people to make agents in a bigger way than I think most, even the other AI companies are, which is fascinating. Because I agree, the agentic architecture is the future of all of this stuff, but it's very hard to build a network of expert agents and different things and have them coordinate with each other and sort of do things together.
It's kind of the leading edge of where, people that are really knee deep in AI are trying to make things happen. And it's certainly, you can see it on the horizon. You can see where it's headed. And you can see that once you have an agent that can carry out a particular task, and you don't even really need an API anymore. Like an agent could potentially go book an airline journey for you or do something, on your behalf through the web. I mean, it can now control a browser interface or a command line interface or anything that a human can do in terms of that. Used to be sort of the limiting factor when we wanted to write some code that did something, is like, how do you get at the data? How do you get to the source material that you need to make decisions, and how do you format it correctly? And now the AI seems to be able to do a lot of that stuff so fluidly, right? Logging into a website and navigating a website. And I mean, that's just right over the horizon for a lot of these capabilities. And so you can start to see the pieces coming together for that.
I keep getting frustrated because there's stuff I try to do and they tell me they won't do it for me. For example, like I had like a list of LinkedIn profile URLs, and I tried it both on ChatGPT and Perplexity. I said, here's 5. I just started with 5. Like, here's these 5. I want you to go get their information and then find me their Instagram profiles. And they both just straight up refused to do it. Like, we're not allowed to scrape data from LinkedIn. This is
guardrails.
Like, this is like, it's unethically immoral or whatever. I was like, oh, come on. This is not immoral.
Yeah, it didn't bother you when you were training yourself, but now it does. That's
exactly. So I'm just, I don't know. I feel like we're just going to keep running into these roadblocks with, like, I'm not even trying to do anything bad or illegal or anything. It won't do it for me. I'm like, you work for me. Go do it.
Right. Well, I think that is the double-edged sword of AI, really, when you think about what its potential is in the context of cybersecurity, because the bad guys, the adversaries, are going to have access to AI, and they're going to have unconstrained AI. They're going to use models that either they've trained or that they've adopted and sort of used in that context, but that don't have those same guardrails. They're out there, right? The models are available. And so the challenge for people that are trying to defend is, how do you account for that? How do you make sure that the bad guys can't use that and weaponize that stuff against you? You're using it for, like you said, not unethical things, just sort of on the edge of what a big company doesn't want you to do because they don't want to be embarrassed by it, or they don't want to be drawn into some lawsuit around it or whatever. And on the extreme other end of the spectrum is people that are just going to use these in all kinds of contexts that we just can't even predict right now. It's going to be military context. It's going to be cyber, warfare, if you will. It's going to be all kinds of different things.
Well, can you talk about how Cloudflare is thinking about AI and like what policies you're instituting as a company? Like, where's the edge? How much can you use? How much do you say maybe not yet?
And also how are they using it internally as well?
Yeah.
We are using machine learning and have been for a long time inside the products. So, again, looking at massive amounts of traffic across this big global network, that traffic itself becomes a source of information that we can use to build better products and make them more effective. Too much data becomes overwhelming. So you have to harness it in some way. And the AI and machine learning algorithms have been a part of those teams' sort of product suite for a long time. I don't know if I can go into super granular detail on exactly what it is, but for example, they're trying to be able to better detect what's a bot and what's a human based on behavior, and like looking at it in terms of how quickly maybe the bot is doing things versus what is a human behavior. That might be one thing. How quickly they're pivoting from one link to another, how quickly they're hitting different links. I mean, all those kinds of timing issues can be one angle of it. There was a blog post I read the other day that I certainly can't do justice here, that Cloudflare posted about all the ways that they're leveraging AI in the context of bot detection and looking for vulnerabilities. Sometimes you can detect a vulnerability even before it's disclosed by using AI machine learning algorithms to sort of see, again, what normal behavior looks like versus what we're seeing. So we're trying to get ahead of vulnerabilities in that way to build a better product in the WAF and the way we manage our network itself. I mentioned earlier trying to optimize network traffic across the network. There was yet another blog post that you can go read about on Cloudflare's blog, all about how we use AI to help us manage the network in a more effective and efficient way. But we're also trying to put AI into the hands of our customers on the edge. So I think that's the exciting thing if you're thinking about building something with AI, is where is it and where does it need to be basically to serve the purposes that you're trying to achieve. And we talked about different countries with different laws and regulations. And I think AI is going to be one of those where we have very different perspectives on what is allowed and what is not allowed, and it will be context sensitive. So putting GPUs inside of Cloudflare servers in all the contexts where our servers live today. We're in 330 cities around the world, 110 countries, and having GPUs rolled out into all those locations for inference purposes is a pretty interesting architecture, right? Most of the GPU infrastructure we think of today is centralized for model training, but model inference, where does that happen, right? Model inference on ChatGPT happens inside of ChatGPT, but maybe it needs to happen near where the end users are consuming data, producing data, moving data, through the platform before it makes its way across the network. Those are all things that we're trying to enable for customers through the Workers AI platform, and giving them access to open source models and GPU inference capabilities right there at the edge. You can do that today. You can go, spin up a Cloudflare Worker or Pages infrastructure and start to integrate with our AI capabilities right there, and use the open source models that are available on, Meta obviously is one of the leaders in that space. So the last one I tinkered with was the new Meta model that came out, and it's available now on our edge.
John, it's interesting because I was looking at something one of my colleagues did the other day, and he'd built a bunch of code to simplify access to an API and make a lot of the work easier. Then he used an LLM and did function calling to input and parameterize it basically and apply it to that JSON. And it got me thinking this weekend, I just remembered this is like, what's the point in simplifying all that stuff for the LLM if the LLMs can understand the complexity of like JSON and things like that? So I'm just wondering, you think we'll start to see a trend where developers just build these APIs that are super capable, but we care less and less about simplifying things for a developer because now we're building APIs for AIs?
Yeah, I have talked about building APIs for AI. I mean, it is the way, obviously, historically, machines have talked to other machines is via API. But again, you just described something that it had to be simple because the developer wanted to make it, they wanted the API, whoever published the API wanted to make it as easy as possible for the developer to integrate with that API as they could. You're right, it matters less now because the AI could go read the documentation if it needed to probably doesn't even need to read the documentation. It probably already kind of knows what it's looking at. It can certainly interrogate the structure and the arc and sort of create its own structure that it now interprets forever. And then the biggest question is, do you even need an API? Because if it can do it through some other interfaces, there's something that we need to sort of always go down that path, or will AI just use the web, like users use the web, like through it's not efficient, but it is certainly already there. And it may be, the way that AI starts to take hold in this agent world where you're just letting the agents run and use the web just like a user would through a browser. But I think, yes, eventually we'll start to evolve some new form of API that is catering to the consumer, so to speak. And the consumer is going to be increasingly some sort of a large language model or other form of AI.
We wanted to talk about your working with Techstars and mentoring new startups that are coming up. So how did you get involved with Techstars, and what do you kind of do with those companies?
Yeah, I have always been interested in startups ever since my Rackspace days. I mean, we were a startup and we got to sort of go through that sort of era ourselves. And then we were also hosting infrastructure for lots of startups in the early days. Everybody leaned on us for the underpinning of their applications. And, you just learn things over the years that are just by experience, and you want to share some of that. So selfishly, I certainly always wanted to invest. I saw what the venture capital guys were doing out there in California. I always wanted to, get rich like they were. But the reality is, investing in startups is a very, very different thing, because it's almost like roulette. You have to put a lot of bets on a lot of different things. You can't ever bet on any one particular startup. So you don't really want to be an individual startup investor. But as a group, when you sort of see a cohort of startups like Techstars did, Techstars had a branch that spun out in San Antonio with the partnership of Rackspace back in the day, and they called it Techstars Cloud. And so my original interest was like, what are all the things people are going to build to make the cloud better? What are they going to build to make managing infrastructure better? Sort of the cloud finance, sort of the financial management around cloud infrastructure. That was kind of a thing that spun out of some of that. And so I was just involved in sort of helping those founders, who were oftentimes young people that had not had a ton of experience either in business or, they were bright. They knew the technology. They knew there was a problem. They wanted to solve it. But then there was a lot of what I call Swiss cheese of all the things that you don't know. And I was just trying to basically get involved and help in that regard. Some of it was self-serving to try to have them build some of those capabilities on top of our infrastructure and our cloud, but also some of it was just curiosity. Basically, I love the new stuff. I like to lean into whatever is new, and those people were always at the leading edge, whether building some. At the time, it was big data. You remember that term, big data? Everybody was using big data, and they were trying to crack the code on what the next database architecture was going to look like, and how they were going to scale beyond the capabilities of existing data platforms. And to me, that was just exciting territory. So I stayed in touch with those folks over the years and have, invested in a few of them, but most of them don't pay out like the big venture capital guys do. You really can't ever, you're much better off in the stock market than you are in venture capital.
Who'd you invest in?
I remember a few so there was one that was called encoding.com. Encoding.com was basically doing video encoding in the cloud. They're no longer a company. They got acquired by somebody else, but that was a fun investment to watch, because we all knew that, the cloud was much more attuned for, doing things like that, encoding, let's just say, mountains and mountains of existing video or real-time video or whatever into all the formats that you needed, the mobile device formats. So encoding.com was one I invested in. Let's see, a lot of my investing was in a fund, like a portfolio like that, so that I didn't have to do it, directly. It became hard to manage and hard to do directly. So I'm trying to think of any other ones that stand out, but most of them were, companies that you probably never heard of. I was never like a Silicon Valley high flyer investor. It was companies that either got acquired or got, some of them failed fundamentally. They're just gone. But
Did you get any returns out of it? If some of them were getting acquired, did you
Yeah, no,
make
I
any money?
probably broke even, probably
Okay.
barely broke even on some of that stuff. And I mean, I continue, the thing about startups is that those funds sometimes go on for many, many, many years. And so you put your money in and you really don't know what your return is going to be 10
10 or
years.
15 years.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, you really can't know. And so it has to be money that is, kind of, it's stuck. It's going to be stuck for a long time. Don't ever ask for it back. Don't expect it back. It's kind of like, put it in there and then forget about it, because that's kind of what it feels like in startup investing, at
Steve
least
and I,
for me.
Steve and I have been trying to invest in things that are like not necessarily SaaS companies or software companies. Or like, I invested in a candy company because my
Ah.
kids like sour candy. So the
I
same people.
say invest in things that you are excited about, just like my topic about CTOs. If you can
Yeah.
invest in things that you're excited about, a little bit about, they always talk about in the financial world trying to beat the market, right? Well, you can't really beat the market over the long term. Even the best investors can't. But the people that can sort of beat the market are the ones that know which companies are interesting, which ones are doing interesting things. And at least in a pocket of your money. Don't put all of it in this stuff. I mean, spread it around. Make sure you're using best practices, but in a certain pocket, you probably have some insight into a particular area. Being able to have seen what Nvidia was doing a little bit ahead of the curve was probably an interesting place to be for a lot of investors, and people in tech knew that Nvidia was kind of a cool company doing interesting things, at least in the crypto space and in terms of gaming. And you could only imagine that they were a hot company, and now you see what's blown up in that space. And there's bound to be others, right? There's other companies that are going to do very disruptive things. And as long as you're paying attention and your sort of head is in it, you might get a chance at investing early.
Good stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't have any particular insight into it other than I let my son who loves sour candy try it, and he goes, "This is really good."
It's good
Okay.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Finalbosssour.com. I'm talking my book. It's okay. I'm an investor.
Great.
Check it out.
The hard part is that, for an individual investor, a lot of these things that you're interested in are not necessarily available. And I think that's what's enticing about the venture stuff. But man, it's a whole different animal when you're thinking about investing in those things. So I think for most people that I talk to, stock market, public companies, funds, mutual funds, those kinds of things are the safest. They're the best in the long term. If you want to tinker around with something, you can dabble with a portion of your money, but it's very, very hard to be a winning investor in that space unless you're just all in.
All right. Anything else, Steve?
I think that's it, John. This was super fascinating. Thanks for taking all this time with us. This was like very
Of
engaging. I
course.
learned a lot. So
I've had fun talking to you guys. You guys are a good podcast hosts. You have some good questions and you think about things similar to the way I do. So I think we're on the same wavelength.
I think
Good.
so.
Well, next time we're at the same conference, let's all get a beer together.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. See you in 2025.
Absolutely. Yeah, John, thanks for coming. Obviously, Cloudflare is a giant of the internet and will continue to be, even though I was surprised and didn't think it was going anywhere 15 years ago, but it proved me wrong. So you're at a great place. And thanks for coming on the podcast. It was a great episode. Thank you.
Yeah.
Of course. Thanks for having me, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everybody.